Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our online travel talk this morning. Also, welcome to those of you who will be watching this on our YouTube channel, Travel Talks Leicester. We're very pleased this morning to welcome Andy Browning, who's done talks for us before at our real travel talks at the Adult Education College in Leicester. I've actually seen this talk that Andy's going to do. This will be my third time, and I love this talk. It's really heartwarming and really interesting. I know you're all going to enjoy it. Andy has suggested that if you would like to make a donation to charity to show appreciation of our talks, then he'd suggest the charity Shelter Box, which is an emergency disaster relief charity that Andy himself, he does some work as part of the response team. So, over to you, Andy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tricia, for having me back. Obviously, slightly different doing this virtually, so we'll see how we go. I think, as we've done before, if there's any questions, I'm going to leave some time towards the end of both halves to answer any questions. So if you put them into the chat box, then I'll do my best to answer those when we get there. So this talk's called Following in Family Footsteps, and it's a story about how an old photograph inspired a new adventure. So they say a picture paints 1,000 words, but I think, to be honest, this picture isn't the most remarkable picture of all time. It's a man in a hat and a bicycle, quite a dapper jacket with some trains in the background. It's fairly unremarkable, but it's a picture that was really familiar to me. So this picture was on my grandmother's wall for as long as I can remember growing up, amongst several other different pictures, and I didn't really give it a second thought, to be honest, until one day I started inquiring a bit more. I wanted to find out a bit more about this photograph, and I asked who this man was, and it turns out this man is my great-grandfather. This is a man called Reuben Head, and that was not too surprising to me. It was a family wall of pictures, but the surprising thing came when my grandmother told me that this picture was in Sudan. Now, at that point, I didn't really know a great deal about the world. I was quite young, but Sudan sounded really exotic, and Khartoum, the capital, sounded even more exotic. So I started asking a few more questions, and my grandmother, indulged me and allowed me to try and find out a bit more. And she showed me a few other pictures. And this is probably my favourite picture of Reuben, just casually there in the evening sun with a monkey on his shoulder and a cigarette in his hand. Quite a cool character, I think, looking at that. And so I started to ask all these questions and try and find out a bit more about this man. And his life sounded really exciting. He spent this time working in a different country, completely different from what I'd experienced at that point. So a plan started to form in my head. And I decided what I wanted to do was try and recreate his journeys. So Reuben would take the train from the south of England up to Liverpool. He would get on a boat. He would take his boat through the Mediterranean and land in Egypt. Then from Egypt, he would take a boat up the River Nile, and then he would take a train from Wadi Halfa into Khartoum. And this sounded like an incredible adventure, an opportunity to learn a bit about my family's sort of ancestry, but also learn a bit more about a part of the world that not many people get a chance to visit. Unfortunately, as so often happens, life got in the way, and this kind of childhood dream of mine that I had kind of fizzled away, and I didn't really give it much thought until fast forward a few years later, and I found myself working in Tanzania. You can see from this picture that posing runs in the family somewhat. And I realized actually Tanzania wasn't too far away from Sudan. And so I sort of started to think about this plan again. I started to think about whether it would be possible to do this journey, but in reverse. So you'll have to indulge me a little bit. I do love a map. I do some geography teaching as one of the things I do. So I thought, you know what, I'm in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. I could take myself, overland into Nairobi in Kenya, then to Ethiopia, and then into Sudan. It sounded like a great trip. So I set about trying to do what I could. So straight away headed to the embassy, and I was told in no uncertain terms that it would be impossible. There's no way we'd be able to do it because at the time we were doing the trip, the border was closed between Kenya and Ethiopia, and it wasn't going to be possible to go overland. So I started to kind of think about other ways around it. So perhaps I could go sort of to the east and go via Somalia. Probably not going to happen. Or perhaps I could go west and go via South Sudan. Again, a country that's kind of not necessarily open to travellers at this point in time. So I decided to cut my losses. Myself and my friend Nick, who I think might be on the call actually. Hi Nick, you're there. we decided that we'd just cut our losses and we'd fly to Ethiopia and we'd try and start the journey there. So we flew to Addis Ababa and we set about doing what we needed to do to try and get permission to get into Sudan. Now, Sudan is a country which doesn't have a large tourism industry. It's not on the sort of a well-trodden tourist trail. It's quite a difficult country to access in a lot of ways. Certain countries in the world, including the US, it's on their veto list. So there's problems getting visas, there's problems getting in. And so we knew it was going to be a bit of a task. Fortunately, there was an embassy in Addis Ababa, so we headed off to the embassy of Sudan. And this is where what I like to call the crystal maze began, if the crystal maze had an admin zone. We had to jump through so many different administration hoops to be able to get all of our permissions to get into Sudan. It became a real chore. So we were told in the first instance, in order to get a visa for Sudan, we'd actually need to get a visa for Egypt, because we'd be traveling overland into Egypt. And if we didn't have permission to enter Egypt, we wouldn't be able to enter Sudan. So we went to the Egyptian embassy and they told us that, yep, no problem. You can get a visa for Egypt, but you need to have passport photos. So we handed over our passport photos only to be told that they were the wrong colour. So then we set about trying to find someone who could change the colour of our passport backgrounds. And we found this lovely chap down an alleyway in Addis Ababa, and he was able to scan in our photos and change the backgrounds. Changing our eye colour at the same time. You can just about see that on those pictures of Nick and myself, that our eyes are both blue, very, very blue in that picture. But they were good enough for the Egyptian embassy, so we went back and we got our visa. And this kind of started a kind of process which we would sort of follow for the next sort of, well, essentially a week in Addis Ababa. So fortunately, whilst we were waiting for all these embassy kind of documents to arrive, we were able to indulge in what is essentially the most amazing thing to come out of Ethiopia, which is coffee. I absolutely love my coffee, and if you do like coffee, you'll know that Ethiopia is quite famous for its coffee, and it has some of the best coffee shops that I've been to. So we kind of got ourselves into a nice little routine. We'd gather in the morning and have a nice Ethiopian coffee and some pastries, and then we'd jump on the train, on the metro, and we'd head back to the embassy. At the embassy, we'd be asked to fill out a form or take a photograph and maybe take that over to another embassy, and then we'd be told to wait. So while we waited, we headed off and had another coffee, and then we would go and try and make the most of the day. There's not a great deal to do in Addis Ababa. There's a couple of museums. This is probably the best article you can find in the museum. And then, of course, we'd go and have another coffee. And so by the time we kind of got to the end of the day, we'd be highly caffeinated and kind of a bit bored for having to spend so much time getting these bits of paper in order. But finally we did. And this is like a really proud picture for me, to actually have this Sudanese visa in my passport, ready to go, permission that allows me to travel into this country that I'd wanted to visit for so long, to try and find out a little bit more about my great-grandfather and the life that he had there. Unfortunately, there was a bit of a problem, and there was a bit of a miscommunication, I think, in the application. And if you look, there's a couple of dates on this visa. So the 15th of January is when the visa was issued, and then the 14th of February was when we were allowed to enter Sudan. So we planned on heading straight to Sudan to make the most of our time there, but unfortunately, we now had a month before we could enter the country. So we sort of sat around for a little while, we had a chat about it and what we could do. The idea of going back to the embassy to try and get another visa just didn't appeal. So we thought, you know what, actually we've got a month. We find ourselves in Ethiopia, let's go on a bit of a detour. So to get ourselves into Sudan, we thought, you know, we'd go the long way around. So rather than taking that direct route from Addis Ababa into the border and then up to Khartoum, we thought we'd go and see what Ethiopia had to offer. Completely unplanned trip. We hadn't done any research. We hadn't looked into where we could go or what we could see. It really was a staging post. So this was quite exciting to have this opportunity to go on a sort of separate adventure in order to get to this planned adventure, if you like. So we left Addis Ababa and we headed north, and we headed to Lake Tana. So Lake Tana is this incredibly large lake in Ethiopia, and it claims to be the source of the Blue Nile. So the River Nile was a river which would become quite important to us later on in the trip. And if you probably know, it starts off as two rivers. You have the White Nile and the Blue Nile. And the White Nile starts in Lake Victoria on the border with Tanzania and Kenya and Uganda. And then the Blue Nile starts in Ethiopia at Lake Tana, or so we thought. So we took a trip on the lake, and the lake is surrounded, sort of full of different islands. And on each of these islands, there are monasteries, and they're guarded by monks. And anything guarded by monks is bound to be important. So we spent our time exploring these islands and starting to learn a bit more about the sort of culture within Ethiopia. Having spent time in Tanzania, it's quite a religious country. It's kind of split down the middle through Christianity and Islam. In Ethiopia, it's very different. It's almost 100% the sort of Orthodox Christian church. A very different type of religion from what I was familiar with. It was a really interesting opportunity to learn about it. So we spent some time on the lake, and we wanted to try and learn a bit more about the geography of the area. It's something that I like to do, and I really wanted to find the source of the River Nile. I knew that we'd be following the Nile for almost its whole length into Khartoum and then into Egypt to follow this journey back to the UK. So we wanted to find the source. But we were told the lake wasn't actually the source. And in fact, we needed to travel up a small tributary that led into the lake to find the real source. So we headed off on these amazing looking bridges, which were just about still standing. And we found this glorious puddle, which lacks a lot of beauty. It lacks that kind of, there's no plaque, there's no sign to say that this is the source of the one of the mightiest rivers on the planet. But sure enough, this is it. This kind of wet, marshy kind of bit of water is the start of the Blue Nile. And it's quite a nice feeling to be at the start of something. It felt like it was the start of our journey because we'd be following this water course. Fortunately, it got a bit more exciting further on, so we followed it back towards the lake, and we got to see some nice waterfalls and do that thing your mum tells you not to do: sit at the top of a waterfall and peer over and take some nice photographs. So we'd kind of started to understand a bit more about where we were and what we were doing, and this part of the country is quite traditional, sort of part of the country, quite rural, quite traditional class. This is sugar cane that's being harvested, but Ethiopia is a country which is changing rapidly, and there's really good road network. This has been partly due to Chinese investment in the country over the last sort of 5 or 6 years, and it makes travelling around a lot easier. Now, we hadn't planned this trip, so we weren't with any sort of tour company, or we weren't going with any guides. We had been doing some work in Tanzania, but it certainly didn't pay a lot of money, so we weren't necessarily hiring our own cars or splashing out on private transport. We were very much travelling as the locals would do on public transport. And public transport consists of these small minibuses that whiz around the country and will get you almost everywhere you need to get to, courtesy of these new roads. So this is a typical minibus. And they were great fun because I'm a big fan of travelling by public transport, and I'm a big fan of using this as an opportunity to meet people from the local area, speak to them, try and understand their way of life and their kind of viewpoints, and also I think they're quite fun. I think this is a nice way to travel. Even the UK, I think, we have quite a negative point of view towards public transport, but you get to see a whole sort of spectrum of society on public transport. So we would squeeze ourselves into the back of these buses and go whizzing around on these roads from location to location. And we found that it was it's quite tricky because the language barrier was quite tough. I'm not a linguist, and Amharic is a particularly tough language, but we learnt a few greetings and we did our best. And on one particular occasion, we were chatting with the driver of the bus, and he was asking us, in broken English and broken Amharic, whether we drove as well. So we thought this is an opportunity to build a relationship. And so we drive. We drive in the UK, and so we showed him our driver's licenses, so our nice little pink plastic cards with our photographs on, which the driver was really impressed with. And he said, "Oh, that's great. Well, you can drive the bus then." And we thought, yeah, okay, we'll laugh and joke. And he said, no, go and you can drive the bus. And he's giggling away. So we thought, okay, we'll call his bluff here. So I went and sat in the driver's seat, and he took a couple of pictures on his phone, and we were laughing and joking, and the passengers in the back think it's very funny. And then he said, okay, we'll swap over now and we'll go. And he's like, no, you can drive. It's fine, no problem. You can start. So I thought, okay, I'm going to call his bluff again here. I'll turn the engine on. So, the minibus's engine started up and it started ticking over. And he kept nodding and he kept saying, yeah, go on. This is, you can do this. I thought, he's not going to let me drive the bus. So I'll really call his bluff here. I'll put it into gear, and then he'll panic and he'll just, we'll stop and we'll swap over. So I put it into gear, and he just sat back on his phone. And so I just instinctively pulled away, and then found myself driving an Ethiopian minibus full of paying passengers. So this was a quite surreal turn of events, but the passengers didn't seem to be bothered. Nick got a turn as well. And so we spent a good 4 or 5 hours driving along the bus route, The conductor would bang on the roof when he wanted us to pull over. People would flag us down. He did all the money backwards and forwards, and we just drove the bus, which we thought was great fun until we got to the end and thought, well, actually, all we've done is we've done that guy's work for him today, and we've not got paid. In fact, we paid him to get on the bus, and we've just done his work. But, you know, if things don't work out, I can always become an Ethiopian bus driver. It's quite a nice thing to put on the CV. So cruising around in the minibuses was a nice way to kind of get from place to place. And the one place we knew we kind of did want to visit was a place called Lalibela. It's probably the most famous sort of tourist site within Ethiopia. And it's famous for its stone churches. They're a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And these stone churches are hewn completely out of the rock. So this church you see in the shape of a cross, this is the Church of St. George, and it is one complete piece of rock that has been carved down into the ground and then been carved out from the inside. And it's an incredible feat of kind of engineering. And they are phenomenal to wander around. And there's not this one church, there's dozens and dozens of these churches filled with their walkways and sort of steps and windows and arts. And to be hewn out of one just complete solid lump of rock is just amazing. And you can't help but feel in awe at the kind of the work that went into it. And the fact that it was done completely by human power is phenomenal. And it really makes you feel like you're in an Indiana Jones film, walking around. So we spent a good few days exploring these tunnels and trying to understand a bit more about it. And they're really kind of sacred places. And quite often within the churches, there's areas you're not allowed to go to. So they have the kind of open area for the congregation. They have an area that's just for priests, and then they have an area that's completely hidden, and no one goes there except for the really high-ranking members of the clergy, or for special occasions. And that's where, you know, relics are kept and things. And each one of these churches is guarded again by more monks and more priests. And they're, you know, very happy to talk about the work they do and where they are. But you certainly aren't crossing that barrier. It is a real sort of sacred site. This isn't a tourist location in the sense of other parts of the world. This is very much a functional religious kind of site of significance. And going around, there was lots of things which, if it wasn't explained to us, we wouldn't necessarily have understood the significance. So, for example, this passageway here, this is called the Gateway to Hell. And it's full of different symbolism like this. So you enter this tunnel, and this tunnel begins to go down. And as it goes down, it's deliberately designed to get sort of shorter and shorter. So you have to kind of duck further and further down to get this idea that you're descending into somewhere pretty horrible and pretty nasty. It's completely devoid of light. And it's quite scary. It's quite intimidating. And then once you've kind of almost crawled through the bottom, you start to see this glimmer of light at the other end. And this is called the Stairway to Heaven. So this is the bit at the end of this tunnel. So this idea of you've passed through this underworld, you've passed through this, bad place, and then kind of, God's light's at the end that you can follow up the stairway and you get out into this kind of beautiful view. So it's really interesting to try and understand a bit more about this really, really old religion. And it was an opportunity to learn something that I hadn't done, which is why I like to travel, because it's an opportunity to learn from other people. We were really fortunate when we went to Lalibela. So Ethiopia follows a different calendar to the rest of the world. Currently, I think it's 2012 in Ethiopia. So if you want to lose 8 years, if you're feeling a bit, you want to take a few years off, you can go back to Ethiopia and tell people you're 8 years younger. And their new year falls in kind of mid-January, and it's called Timkat. So, and we were really fortunate. It just so happened that our visit, again, completely unplanned, coincided with Timkat. And Timkat was one of the days where these churches were sites of pilgrimage, and they would get out the relics and they would have these big celebrations. And so Lalibela was absolutely full of people. And it was just the atmosphere was fantastic. We felt so lucky and so fortunate to be there. Big party atmosphere, lots of singing, lots of dancing. Again, kind of an opportunity to see something which you wouldn't necessarily see elsewhere in the world. This wasn't put on for tourists. This was just there, part of the celebrations of Timkat. And so people would crowd around this church in particular, this Church of St. George. Now, you can see there's quite a noticeable drop down here. There's no barriers. There's no kind of nothing to stop you falling over the edge. It's quite a significant fall. And when you're walking around, it's quite easy to stay away from the edge. But then you get Timkat celebrations, and everyone is getting as close to the church as they can. Now, how people didn't fall is, I don't know. But You can see how many people are there. You can see people in the trees in the background and people pushing and shoving just to get a view of the church and a view of this. So this is the picture of St. George. So St. George is a patron saint of Ethiopia and of the church. And this relic only comes out once a year. It comes out on Timcat. So again, the kind of the fortunates that we had to actually see this on a completely unplanned trip in a place that we hadn't planned to go to was really, really nice. So this kind of it helped sort of formulate that, you know, this trip that we're doing, it's something that, you know, we're on the right track, which was really nice. So going into Ethiopia, there wasn't a great deal that we knew about it. Now, we knew about the coffee, and I'd heard a few bits about it, but there was one thing that I did know about Ethiopia, and it goes back to when I studied earth science at university. And I knew about this area up in the kind of northeast of the country, near the border with Eritrea. Now, if you look at it from a satellite image, it's quite strange. It's really different from the rest of the picture. There's these big dark areas, there's kind of these really blue kind of turquoise lakes. And it's an area called the Danakil, or the Dalal, and it's an area which has had quite a troubled past. It's had quite a turbulent kind of history with the border between Ethiopia and Eritrea. At the time that we went, they were still officially at war with each other, so this area was quite well guarded. There's quite a big military presence. It's not really advised that tourists spend a lot of time there, and there's not a great deal for tourists to do there unless you have a particular interest in one thing. And that's volcanoes and volcanology, which is something that I really do have quite an interest in. It's what I studied at university, and there's one volcano in particular which I'd heard a lot about, I'd seen a lot written about, which is based in this area in northeast Ethiopia within the Danakil. It's called Erterale, and being so close to it, I couldn't pass up the opportunity to try and visit. So Nick and I decided, you know what, we'll do what we can. We're going to try and visit this volcano. And so we set off. And so we set off from Lalibela, the kind of the foothills of the mountains, and then we headed up over these mountains. The mountains in Ethiopia are substantial. They are big mountains. And this is kind of just one of the passes over the mountains. And you can see, you know, it's cold, it's miserable, it's wet. And, you know, they are real quite high altitude. But then you drop down the other side of these mountains and you've left those kind of green foothills behind, and you find yourself in a desert. And it really is a stark contrast to go from one side of the mountains to the other side of the mountains. And then we were in real, you know, dry, sandy, kind of scrubby desert land with camel trains to kind of really hammer home the point that we're in a different environment now. Still, the roads persisted, these incredible roads that had just been paved seemingly in the middle of nowhere. And this road literally led to nowhere. You just followed it and followed it and followed it for hours and hours and hours. And it got to the end of the road. And then this was at the end of the road. So this is where the Danakil really starts. And it's one of the lowest places on the planet. So there's areas of the Danakil which are 100 meters below sea level. And as a result, you have these huge salt flats where there's been water, which is evaporated in the heat, kind of equatorial heat. It's left behind these salt deposits. And as a result, there's a small community that live quite near to these salt deposits, and they have done for thousands and thousands of years. And they're known as the Afar people. The Afar people are quite a seemingly hostile people, but that's unfair. They've been sort of had a lot of problems with people from both sides of the border coming into their area. Economically, they relied on the salt for thousands of years, and it has been a really good, lucrative trade until the last 50 years or so, where now salt's able to be mined or farmed or made cheaper. So they are in a position where they're really struggling, and they're quite sort of suspicious of outsiders. So it's quite a hostile place to travel at times, but they do welcome people in within organised groups. So this was the only time on our trip where we sort of had to go with an organised group to try to gain access to this area. But it is a stunning area. It is beautiful. So when the road ran out, we just headed off onto the salt flats. And it's the first time I've seen a salt flat before. So again, this kind of weird geological oddity, I wanted to make the most of it and try and sort of experience it. So what's the first thing you do when you're on a salt flat? Well, you pick up a chunk of salt and you taste it just to see how salty it actually is. I can confirm it's pretty salty. And again, it's kind of one of those things where you see the pictures and it plays the perspective, but until you're there and you see this, you know, endless horizon and the kind of the heat shimmer coming off this layer of white salt and the small layer of water, it's an odd place to be, but a really quite exciting place. So we camped at the end of this road in a small town. There's nothing in this town except for a sort of military garrison. and this hotel. This was our hotel for the evening. Very comfortable beds, but if you sleep in the desert, so these were our kind of the guys who they get posted there. So they were there for kind of 12 months at the end of the road, and that was their military service in the middle of nowhere. So they were quite pleased to see people that weren't necessarily their barrack friends. This was, these were the community there, this sort of army guys, and this hotel where you sleep in the desert and you wake up like this. This is not too dissimilar to my lockdown here, full of sand. I had spent an amazing night in the desert, looking up at the stars in the middle of nowhere, on the edge of salt flats, on somewhere I'd never dreamed that I'd be. So I'll take the silly looking hair. So we headed out into the salt flats the next day, and this is the land of the camel. And you start to see how camels are so well adjusted to this area in this part of the world. And we saw the salt mines where the salt is, by hand carved out of the ground, and we had to go. It's hard work, hot work. It's about 42 degrees at this point. No water, no shade. And then these are the real experts, the Afar, who they carve the salt into these perfect tablets of salt to go onto the camels to send off to the markets. And these tablets are all identical sizes. They have nothing to measure them with, just their eyes. But every single Afar craftsman carves them to the exact same dimensions. And you can take any tablet, compare it to another tablet, and it's the same. And it starts to get really, really strange, this landscape. It starts to get otherworldly. It's the only way I can describe it. It starts to get like I imagine it would be if you walked around on Venus. These areas of sulfur deposits and acid lakes. It's a very, very strange part of the world, but exciting. It feels dynamic. It feels, you can really start to feel that power of the planet, that kind of tectonic activity. And it's exciting. If you like to see places which are unusual, this to me doesn't feel like it should be on Earth, yet it's not too far away from Lalibela, the other side of those mountains. And so it was a real pleasure and sort of privilege to experience it. And then we continued and we carried on through the desert, and we started to get to these volcanic landscapes, this kind of dark black basaltic kind of deposits, where the road again runs out and you head off towards a pretty unremarkable rise on the horizon. So this, believe it or not, is the volcano. This is Ertarale. It doesn't look like much. It doesn't really look like your typical volcano. But there's something quite special about it. So we base ourselves at the base of the volcano, and again, the only thing there is a small military outpost. But this isn't the kind of the national service type military outpost. This is the kind of real sharp end of things. This is right near the border with Eritrea. So this is exclusively kind of manned by special forces, and they're quite serious people. They definitely know they're there to do a job should they need to. And so we headed up with some armed guards up over the lava fields towards a volcano. And as we reached the summit, we started to see what it was that I wanted to see, that kind of the thing that drew me into this area and why I knew this was exciting. Because Ertarale is one of the few volcanoes in the world that has an active lava lake. So when you get to the top of that volcano, you can actually see down into that volcano and see bubbling lava. And a lot of people think that that's a cartoon image of a volcano, but there's not that many places in the world you're able to see it. So it's always been on my list of things to be able to see and to be able to do. And I was really fortunate to be able to do that. And it was a long night, and you get there at night time, you can see this glow, and then you camp on the side of the volcano. But I definitely didn't sleep that night. I just spent all night staring at this incredible kind of power from within that drives our planet, and it's a really great example of those forces. Wake up in the morning, or sort of walking down in the morning, you got to see these sort of rock formations, and this is some of the newest rock on our planet. This is erupted maybe 2 days ago, and it's sort of frozen into these shapes, and it's like nature's sculpture park. This has once been that kind of flowing viscous lava that's kind of solidified into these rolling bits, and you get this stuff called Pele's hair, which is kind of volcanic glass, which as it comes down in these tiny droplets strings out and solidifies into this kind of solid glass, which is again pretty special to see and quite exciting if you're a bit of a geology geek like me. So we were getting near to our time to enter Sudan. So we continued round and we went back over the mountains, and we found ourselves in the Simien Mountains. And the Simien Mountains are a really unique habitat. They kind of have almost like a cloud forest, but it's not a tropical cloud forest. So it has a really unique flora and fauna. And again, beautiful, stunning mountains, which I hadn't really thought about beforehand, having not done a great deal of research on Ethiopia before we arrived. And some of the unique animals that you find there are these. So these are Enchilada monkeys. and you only find these Enchilada monkeys in these mountains. They're the only place in the world that you'll find them, and they know that it is their home. They certainly aren't letting humans take over anytime soon. They are very, very territorial, and they are quite abundant in number. And they're quite happy for you to get close, but they'll soon tell you who's in charge and tell you who the boss is. This is about as close as we get. I quite like this picture. It's kind of the interesting juxtaposition between humans and apes, and shows we're not too dissimilar. And by that stage, I think we've had about as much hair on our faces as these guys as well. So this was kind of towards the end of our time in Ethiopia, and it had been such an unexpected sort of bonus to the trip, and something that I really hadn't really thought about before, but I'm so glad that we got the opportunity to do it. So as we approached the 14th of February, that opportunity to get into Sudan, we approached Metemma. Metemma is the border town between Ethiopia and Sudan, and it was here that we really started to hit home where we were going and what we were going to be doing, and it got really exciting. I didn't know what to expect in Sudan. I deliberately hadn't tried to come up with any sort of preconceived ideas about what it might be like. I tried to steer clear of the stereotypes that you might hear about in the media or news stories and things like that. And so we were about to cross the border and basically experience that for the first time. So I think what I'll do is I'll stop this half here, and then I think afterwards, after our break, we'll come back and we'll talk about actually going into Sudan. I think there's a few questions, so I'll have a little look and see what's said. So who we got here? Public transport. Yeah, so public transport was, it really was, I'm really a big fan of traveling by public transport. So the conducted tour, so in order to get into that area, you had to take that tour. So those Land Rovers you saw at the top of the mountain, they were the sort of, they were the transport that took us in, and they took us into Danakil and then over to the volcano. You can only drive as far as that kind of base camp. You can't get any further, and then you walk. So we hiked up to the top of the volcano and back, and then we drove back out again to a town called Mekelle. Mekelle is kind of the gateway to the Danakil, if you like, and Mekelle is on that kind of main road within Ethiopia. And it's kind of it's about 4 days, I think it took us. It took us a couple of days to get to the volcano, a day up and down, and then a couple of days back as well. But it's the only way to do it. So you can't get permission to get into that area, and you need police permissions, military permissions, and so doing it without a group is really, really difficult to do that. So we made that concession because we wanted to see that, and we wanted to have that experience, of that incredible part of the world. I don't know if there's any other questions, or whether we want to leave it there and then start back again.
Yeah, shall we do that? I don't know if can hear me. Can you?
Yeah, can hear you.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, I think we're all just stunned really, because it's just amazing, isn't it? It's just such a different kind of area of the world that most of us have experienced. So I just wanted to ask, the salt miner people there working, do they kind of work there for like, I don't know, so many weeks and then go home, or?
So the Afar people live there all year round. So the Afar people who mine the salt, they live there. They live there completely, and they've had to really adapt to live in quite harsh environment, and they do that very well. There is sort of a seasonal labour force, if you like. So in the mountains, the people from the mountains come down in the winter time to do that kind of the hard work, if you like. So breaking up the salt, the hard physical labour. That tends to be the people from the mountains who come and do that, but only when it's not too hot. And then they provide some income, but the Afar are there year round.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that. Anyway, you've inspired at least one person who's decided it's on her agenda.
You should go.
So,
Ethiopia
anyway,
is a fantastic country, beautiful place.
Thank you. Thanks, Andy, and we'll look forward to seeing you in a short while.
Brilliant.
Thanks everyone.
The change between Ethiopia and Sudan was really quite stark. Having gone from sort of the very orthodox Christianity of Ethiopia into the very Islamic country of Sudan, churches were replaced by mosques. You had the Ethiopian football shirts, which were replaced with kind of traditional Sudanese dress. Language changed from Amharic into Arabic. It was real, quite a big change to cross that border. And I was so excited to finally be there. It was a country which had always held this fascination for me, and it was an opportunity to go and experience it for myself. But not only that, it's to try and understand a bit more about why my great-grandfather was there and how he found himself to be there. So I was expecting these kind of, these big kind of important kind of buildings and bits of culture that I wasn't aware of. Yet when we first arrived in Sudan, our first kind of image of it was this, the Kak chicken shop. So not exactly top of the tourist list of places you want to visit. However, this is a bit disingenuous because when we actually first arrived in Sudan, we arrived in the middle of the night. So we'd got quite good at buses by this stage. We were pretty happy about jumping on our public transport and getting to where we needed to be. When we got to Sudan, things changed slightly. And so what actually happened, it meant we could have spent a bit of time at the border and waited for the following morning, or we could have just pressed on to get to Khartoum, the capital. So we decided to press on to get to the capital sort of as soon as we could. And that meant we arrived in the middle of the night. So we arrived in the middle of the night, and the guy on the bus dropped us off and then went his separate way. And so we were left sort of on our own in the middle of this capital city in a country which we didn't know a great deal about. There was no one around. If our Amharic was bad, our Arabic was probably even worse. And we didn't really know what to do. So we started to wander, essentially. We sort of knew the area where there might be some hotels, and so we sort of vaguely pointed ourselves in that direction and headed off into the night to try and find somewhere where we could go. It didn't really work out as planned. We found a few hotels and we knocked on the doors, but no one would answer the door. And so we were sort of aimlessly wandering, to be honest. We found a few shops that were open and we asked in there, but the language barrier made it very, very difficult. So we didn't really know what we were going to do with ourselves. And it got to the point where we were considering just finding a space on a sort of quiet street corner and just laying down and having a bit of a nap and then waking up when the sun came up. And we kind of decided that was going to be the case. And so we were scoping out the street corners. And then something quite remarkable happened. A man came around the corner as if from nowhere and introduced himself. This man's name was Aziz. So this is Aziz in the middle here. This is taken a little bit later. And Aziz introduced himself and sort of just had started to have a bit of a chat. Sort of asked us who we were and what we were doing. And so we explained, we're in Sudan, we've just arrived, we don't really know where we're going. And that's the scenario we're in. And so he then said to us, well, you guys need somewhere to stay. We said, absolutely, brilliant. Yeah, we do. If you could recommend somewhere, or if you could point us in the right direction, that'd be fantastic. It's definitely much better than sleeping on the side of the road. And he said, well, no problem. Come with me. So we followed Aziz and turned a corner, expecting him to sort of point us in the direction of a sort of a bus station or a taxi rank or a hotel. And then he got his keys out of his pocket and he opened up the door to his apartment. He's like, I live here. You can stay with me. And we're like, oh, that's amazing. That's so kind. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And so we walked up the stairs to his apartment, and then he said, no, just wait here for a second. And we're like, okay. He's like, I just need to check with my wife. So he went inside and he checked with his wife, and he came out again and he said, it's fine. The baby's sleeping, so you can come in and you can stay in my place. So not only is this man taking two strangers off the street, pretty hairy, smelly, dusty-looking strangers who've been on a bus for a couple of days, he's then taken us back to his house, where his wife's asleep, where his 18-month-old baby's asleep, and he's welcomed us into his house. At this point, it's about maybe 2 o'clock in the morning, but rather than just saying, there you go, guys, there's the sofa, that's for you, we'll speak about it in the morning, Aziz went up completely above and beyond. He made us food, he gave us fresh bread, fresh cake, he had 2 beds for us to stay on, and he stayed up chatting with us for a good hour and a half after this. So yeah, this is our kind of homemade hummus, homemade bread, homemade cake, some dairy triangles, they kind of snuck in there. And this was our kind of first introduction to what was to become just a kind of a way of life in Sudan. It's often said, people travel to different places and it's often, the hospitality is often remarked upon, and people say, oh, people in that country were so hospitable, or people here were really, really friendly. In Sudan, it's a step above that. It was to the point where it was so socially ingrained that it almost became embarrassing for us how out of the way people would go to help us. And it was so humbling, and we were so lucky and so fortunate to actually have that experience. And Aziz was the prime example of that. So much so that in the morning when we woke up, he was due to go to work. But instead of going to work, he rang his boss and said, look, I'm going to be late because I've picked up these two randoms from the street and they're currently sleeping in my house. And he made us breakfast, and he checked through and he explained a bit about Khartoum and about Sudan, and sort of went out of his way to kind of make us feel welcome and make us sort of feel comfortable with where we were and what we were doing. So it was the most incredible introduction to a place, to be, you know, rock bottom considering sleeping on the street corner, to, you know, living it up with homemade food with this incredible man in his house. It was fantastic. So this was a really positive start for Sudan, and it kind of only got better from there through our various experiences. So going back to the visa, we know we had a few problems getting it initially, but actually, as it turned out, it allowed us to have that excellent trip in Ethiopia. But what you're required to do with your visa is you have to get it validated within sort of 3 days of arriving in the country. So if it's not validated in Khartoum, in the capital, then it's invalid. And an invalid visa in Sudan could spell a few problems. So we set about getting this validation, and that required quite a few hoops to jump through again. Administration is something that's quite important. So we had to visit various government ministries. We had to do some really interesting kind of mathematics when it came to changing money. We had to go to the airport, and then we had to go to the tourism office, and we had to get permission to take photographs, and we had to get permissions to travel outside of Khartoum. But it wasn't a hassle. It wasn't a problem, because what it allowed us to do was to explore this city that, again, I didn't really have an idea of what to expect. Deliberately didn't do a lot of research because I wanted to sort of experience it the first time. And I was absolutely amazed by the things we would see walking around. Khartoum is full of this really amazing kind of traditional architecture, beautiful mosques and minarets, and a real kind of testament to the culture and history of this city. Alongside that, there's the kind of colonial history that's there as well. It's quite important, particularly at the moment. We're having lots of conversations about historical past and what that has looked like in different parts of the world. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that for a big part of Sudan's history, there was a colonial element. You know, it was occupied by a foreign government, the British government. And so it's something that's important to, I think, learn about and to try and understand a bit more. And as it transpired, Reuben, my great-grandfather, was part of that colonial government. So it was important for me to try and understand as much about it as possible, especially as I was there as a guest in that country. So it's really interesting to see these two histories kind of side by side. And then there's a third side to Khartoum as well, which I absolutely hadn't expected. Khartoum is a real modern, bustling city. And this is a really, brand new hotel. It was funded by a man you might have heard of called Colonel Gaddafi. This is Gaddafi's egg. And at the time, there was a lot of money coming from Libya into this part of Africa to kind of support the development of places like Egypt and Sudan and Ethiopia to a certain extent. So this is one of the hotels that were built. And it's as you would expect a five-star hotel to be. We certainly looked out of place in our kind of dusty traveling gear. But we went in, and we went in for one specific reason, because it had a rooftop kind of restaurant, and you got the most incredible views of the River Nile from the top of this restaurant. So the River Nile runs right through the middle of Khartoum, and it splits it into Khartoum North and Khartoum South. And it's the point at which the two Niles meet. It's this confluence of the Blue Nile and the White Nile. So you remember that we visited the source of the Blue Nile back in Ethiopia. And now we had this opportunity to see where that body of water had gone on its own journey. We'd gone on our journey to get to this point in Sudan, but the river had been on its own journey as well. And we had this opportunity to get down onto that confluence. And for me, as a bit of a geography geek, someone who loves kind of these different geological oddities, I wanted to go and stand at that point. I wanted to go and stand on the confluence where these two amazing rivers join together and become the River Nile that we all know. So we tried to head down to stand as close as we could to this confluence. We just about made it. So you can't really see. This could be anywhere, so you're going to have to take my word for it. But this is the point at which these two rivers join. One river having come from Lake Victoria, thousands of miles to the south, and then the other one having come from Ethiopia, kind of hundreds of miles to the east. And it was a really important point for us, because from this point on, we'd basically be following the River Nile on its journey all the way up to the Mediterranean. And so it's important for us to kind of acknowledge one, where we'd come from, but also where we were going. And the River Nile is, it does equal life in this part of the world. Elsewhere away from the Nile, it is desert. It's very, very hot and arid. So without the Nile, life wouldn't have been able to exist for thousands of years that it has done. And so the Nile is really, really important. It provides everything, including food. So we were really spoilt with the food in Ethiopia. But when we got to Sudan, things stepped up to a whole new level. Every single day we would get fresh fish like this. We would get fresh bread, and we would get this kind of this brown paste that you can see over here. It's called ful, and ful is probably one of my all-time favourite meals. It's broad beans or fava beans, boiled up with lots of herbs and spices, served fresh, and you get your lime and your onion, and it's the staple food, and it is absolutely delicious. And I would eat vats of it if I could. And it was just this kind of, it was so easy to slot into this everyday life because there wasn't, this big tourism trail. There wasn't this big kind of, must-see things. It was just easy to slot into the everyday life. And that everyday life involved walking around the city, seeing the various bits and pieces that were there, eating the food, taking time in the shade to have a cup of tea or to have a fresh juice, and just to do what everyone would do. This is a Friday night in Undaman, which is on the north side of the Nile. And this is where every Friday, the people of the community just come out to have a sing, to pray, to dance. And you have the famous kind of whirling dervishes come out and do their dances. And it was a real privilege to be there, not because it was, a tourist must-see. It wasn't being put on because we were from outside and it was a demonstration. It's just what happened on a Friday. And Aziz was kind enough to take us down to show us, what went on and what he would do on a Friday night. And that was really, really nice. It was a real privilege to experience that. So walking around, there's not a great deal to do in Khartoum. I mean, I was more than happy just to wander and see and people watch. But there are a couple of small museums. And this is the old church in Khartoum. And inside there is a museum to the colonial history. So like I said, I think it's really important that we try and understand a bit of that colonial history. So we went in and we started to sort of look at some of the artifacts and some of the pictures. I'll be honest, not the most remarkable museum I've ever been to. Most of the pictures were a bit dull, including ones like this. And I almost didn't think twice about this picture. I sort of just moved on. But something made me come back to it and have a bit of a closer look. So, it's quite an interesting picture in the sense that it's, a testament to the colonial kind of history of the country. There's people there from Sudan, people there from the UK. You can see the British flag in the background. There's also something else in the background which kind of sort of gave myself a bit of attention, which is this man here. If you zoom in a little bit, this man here you might recognise, and I've certainly sent a bit of a, recognise, or something in my brain kind of clicked when I saw this picture, because this man sat at the back of this room looking incredibly bored is the same man that's in this photograph, my great-grandfather, Reuben. Now, what I really like about this was just how bored he looks, because I'm not one for paperwork or sat at a desk. I will do anything to get out of that. All the work that I do is very much outside if it can be, or it's active or it's doing something. The idea of being sat down doing admin is not my idea of fun. And it looks like Reuben's got the exact same idea in his head. So I love the fact that he sat there looking incredibly bored, because it gives me some, hope that actually, it's not a problem. We all find it boring. So it kind of reminded me of actually why we were there and, this idea of trying to find out a little bit more about it. Now, initially, when I'd tried to do a bit of research about Reuben, my grandmother had given me lots of other photographs, either Reuben's photographs or perhaps some postcards that he had of his time in Khartoum. So what I thought would be a nice idea is to try and go about matching some of these old photographs with the current photographs to try and see if things had changed, if they had changed, what sort of changes had there been. So it was quite an interesting task, and I thought it was a nice way to try and find out a bit more about Khartoum. So we started off with the Grand Hotel. This one was really, really easy to match up because the Grand Hotel is still standing, it's still called the Grand Hotel, and it's still pretty much the same. And it's on a really prevalent street right next to the Nile, and it's a nice, easy starter to sort of get an idea of this history. The War Office, and obviously we're no longer at war. The War Office is no longer necessary in Khartoum, but the building still stands to a point. So it turns out it was actually knocked down, but when it is rebuilt, it is rebuilt in the exact same style, and it's now the National Bank. So this is, the Sudanese bank, really impressive building, but built in the same style as that original War Office. So I was getting quite excited about this now. This is quite a fun game to try and match up what was going on. The Palace in Khartoum is where the president resides. A really important building, both historically and also today. Today, it's a bit more security conscious, so you can't quite get that close to it, and it's not necessarily the thing you want to take pictures of. When we signed onto our license to get our photography licenses at the Ministry of Tourism, we were told there's certain things we can't take pictures of, and the palace was one of those places. So we had to take a sneaky picture from the other side of the River Nile. That's as close as I could get. As far as I'm aware, it's pretty similar to how it was, but quite difficult to see from this side of the Nile. This was quite an easy one, actually. So these boats, these sort of paddle steamers, would go up and down the Nile, and they would be the main sort of form of transport. Now, what I really like is you can see the writing on that picture is actually this boat is owned by the Sudanese Railway Company. And this would be the sort of boat that Reuben would have taken on his stints on the Nile, where the train wasn't running or it wasn't built yet. So we wanted to try and find these boats. And actually, it's quite a sad story because there are quite a few of these boats still on the side of the river, but they're not used now. They're not used at all. There's more modern boats. Transport infrastructure is a lot better. And so these kind of once great boats are kind of just sat there in the sun, and they're not looking too good for themselves, which is a shame. But you know, that's how things progress, and actually that's important as well, to acknowledge that the changes. The post office. So again, the post office it took a while to find, and actually it was one of the ones that we did last to try and actually find the post office. And we couldn't quite work it out until one day we were walking past a building. We found one that looked just like it. We're like, okay, that looks pretty good. That looks pretty close to it. So I had this old picture in my pocket, and I was trying to line up the best kind of viewpoint with my camera to just about get it right. And I snapped the picture, and I was quite happy with how it compared and how it matched up. And I put my phone in my pocket, and I went about carried on to back where we were heading. And a man came running over to me, and he seemed quite agitated. He seemed quite concerned about something. And he was saying, you're trying to speak to me, and it was the language barrier was quite difficult. And he was sort of gesturing for me to come with him. I said, okay, I'll come with you. And up until this point, everyone who had sort of approached us had been so curious about what we were doing and friendly, and had offered to buy us food or tea. I thought this was part of that hospitality that we experienced. So I followed the man, and we went around a corner, and there was a sort of a gated wall, and we sort of went through into this yard, and the gate kind of slowly closed behind me. And then I realised at that point that this man had a sort of a badge on his lapel, and then looking up, I saw lots of men with badges on their lapels, and it turned out that I was in a police sort of station, in a police yard, and I couldn't really understand what was going on. I thought, this is a bit strange. And then they asked me to sit down at a table. Everyone's being very friendly. I sat down at the table, and then they sort of went around and found out who the best person to speak to me would be. And the man addressed me, and he sort of said, can you explain why you've taken a picture of that building? So I said, I wanted to take a picture because, I've got an old picture and I want to match it up. He's like, oh yeah, because that building's the Ministry of Defence, and you're not really allowed to be taking pictures of it. And then it kind of dawned on me that I'd been kind of going about this in a quite, happy-go-lucky kind of way. And what I'd actually done in reality is I'm a foreigner in a different country, and I've taken a picture completely unsolicited of a government building, which is quite a sensitive government building, and that's probably frowned upon. And so I realised quite quickly that I was in a bit of a situation here. And so I thought, my Arabic isn't good enough to talk my way out of this. I'm potentially in quite serious trouble here. I've signed a document to say that I won't take pictures of these sort of buildings. What do I do? And so I quickly just thought on my feet, and I got my phone out, and I got all the old pictures out, and I sort of said, look, this is me, these are the old pictures, and this is what I'm trying to do. And fortunately, this was one of the last ones we'd done, so they were able to see all the previous pictures. And so fortunately, they kind of saw what I was trying to do, they bought into the idea, and within 5 minutes, it was all smiles, people were laughing and joking, and I had tea, and we sat down and had a nice chat for 20 minutes, and then I left, reminding myself to be a little bit more careful next time, and actually I should acknowledge what I'm taking pictures of. So it's something which could have been, a bit of a bad situation, and elsewhere in the world, perhaps I wouldn't have been given the benefit of the doubt. But again, I think it's testament to that warmth to outsiders that we found all over Sudan, that actually they are willing for me to have an opportunity to explain myself and what I was doing. And they allowed me to say, that's fine. It's not a threat. But of course, with all the photographs, there was one photograph that had started it all, and it was the one photograph that I really wanted to try and recreate. So this is the photograph that was on my grandmother's wall for so long, and obviously it's at a train station. So I thought, well, this one's going to be relatively easy to do, hopefully. So we headed off to the station in Khartoum. Now, this is the old station. There's a much newer one now, and this one's kind of falling into disrepair slightly, but it is still functioning. It's mainly through goods. It takes goods to different parts of the country, but we were surprised to find some people sat in here still working. And so we approached them, we sort of tried to explain what we were doing, and didn't go about just taking random photos this time, kind of sought permission and asked some questions. And we were really fortunate to be put in touch with this man. This is Mohammed. Mohammed is a very proud worker of the Sudanese Railway Corporation, and he completely bought into what we were trying to do. He thought it was great, he was excited by it, and so he took us on a tour of the station, and he took us right up towards the end where there was lots of old rolling stock, all the old carriages, and he allowed us to sort of get in and have a bit of an explore and sit in what are probably the most uncomfortable train seats I've had the pleasure of sitting on. The idea of spending any length of time on these old wooden rickety seats does not fill me with a great deal of fun, but this would have been the type of train that, again, Ruben would have taken on his journeys from the UK up to Khartoum, and so it was really nice to be able to see that. And also they feature in the back of the photograph, so that was quite, again, a nice thing to see, if not the same, similar carriages that Ruben would have been used to seeing in his time during Khartoum. We went into the engine shed where we met the chief engineer, and Mohammed explained to the chief engineer what we were trying to do, and he again absolutely bought into it. And he was a real railway aficionado, if you like. So he and his little crew of men got together and they studied the photo fastidiously, and they really looked at the railway lines that were there, and they said, you know what, we can figure this out. And they went out and they measured the distance between tracks, and they measured the width of the tracks, and they worked out the angle of the sun, and they worked out as best as they could imagine exactly where these tracks were and exactly what lines they were on, exactly what orientation. They even got to the point where they suggested we might be able to shuffle the carriages, get an engine in there to move the carriages so they're at the point as they would be in the photograph, which we acknowledged, but didn't really want to inconvenience them that much. But it was really nice to have these people so enthusiastic about what we were trying to do and so interested by the photograph that I've been interested by. But obviously, as well as the trains, there's one key factor in this picture, which is the bicycle. And I just planned on taking a picture next to the railway, sort of being in a similar place. But the chief engineer was having none of this. He was like, absolutely, you need a bicycle. And so he turned to one of his workmates and he fired off a few things in Arabic. And without thinking, this guy just went off at a pace and ran into the other end of the engine shed. And about a minute later, came back on a bike incredibly similar to the one that Ruben had. And so then we set about probably the most kind of paparazzi style thing I've ever had experience for me in trying to get it all lined up perfectly to create this photograph. So this for me is kind of the pinnacle, if you like, of what we are trying to achieve. It's not the best match, but it's pretty close. Now, the thing that really lets me down with this photograph, I love it and it reminds me of this great adventure, but I'm really disappointed at how well dressed Ruben is compared to how I'm dressed. I'm wearing dusty old trainers, trousers that are dusty. I actually turned my t-shirt inside out because it had a logo on it, and I didn't want that logo to be put in the photo for posterity. So I thought I'd turn it inside out, and I'm just a bit of a mess. Whereas Ruben's looking quite dapper, looking quite sharp. But it's such a nice sort of thing to be able to at least attempt to have done. And what I really like is just the similarities on the bicycle. If you look at like the mud guards and you look at the kind of the guard of protection around the chain, it's pretty similar to the one that he would have ridden, which is really exciting. And everyone else was really happy with the picture. And then we set about another half an hour of taking every combination and permutation of pictures you can imagine. Everyone wanted to get involved. And I've hundreds of these pictures with me and with Nick and Mohammed and the chief engineer. And it was just such a fun afternoon with everyone getting involved and being part of that story. And that's so nice for me to have the story to go with that picture and to go with that photograph. So we were going to sort of like leave Khartoum. We were running out of time. So we only had a 2-week transit visa, and 2 weeks isn't a lot of time. So we need to head north and we need to cross back into Ethiopia, into Egypt in the north. So we said to Aziz, you've been so kind to us. You sort of really helped us out in our hour of need. We'd love to sort of recognise that by taking you out for dinner to say thank you. So we said, you pick the restaurant and we'll pay for dinner. So Aziz picked this restaurant. It's a restaurant come butchers. So you go into the butchers and you pick what meat you want to have. It's all goat. So you pick which goat you want, and then you walk around the back of the butchers, and there's about a dozen guys lined up with barbecues, and they barbecue it right there in front of you. And it's the best goat I've ever tasted. It was a great evening. And then we came to the end of the evening, and we'd had a great evening with Aziz, chatting about his life and our life and where we were going next. And it came to pay, and we said, Aziz, not a problem, we'll have this. And then he looked at us quite sternly. And Aziz is not a stern man; he's a very friendly man. And he looked at us quite sternly. He said, "I cannot allow you to pay." And so then we had this kind of hospitality standoff. We were very much, we want to do the right thing. And he said, well, I want to do the right thing. And so I'll pay. No, I'll pay. And he got to the point, he got quite heated. And he said, I cannot, as a good man of this community, allow you to pay for your dinner. And we said, you know what, we can't argue with him. So fine. So what we thought we'd do is we'd get one ahead of him. And we said, well, you pay for dinner, and then we'll pay for the tea afterwards. So that was our plan. So he went off to pay for the dinner. We ran over to the guy to buy tea. And then we got there and we've got the tea and we got our money out to pay for the tea. And Aziz had already paid for it. When he paid for the dinner, he'd already paid for the tea. And we thought, okay, you've won there, Aziz, no problem. We had the evening with Aziz, which was great. And then the following morning, it was our time to leave. So we headed to the station. So this is the station, as it would be in Rubens' day, and then the modern station today, not looking too dissimilar. And to get to the station, we went by taxi. And so Aziz had sorted out a taxi for us. And when we arrived, we went to pay the taxi driver, and he said, no, Aziz has already paid. You don't need to pay for the taxi. And we thought, well, that's incredible. A nice man. We'll have to find some way to repay him later on. And then we started walking towards the station with our bags. And then the taxi driver came running after us. And we thought, okay, there's been some miscommunication. We do need to pay. So the taxi driver came running up, and then we went to pay. And he said, no, you don't need to pay, but you forgot this. And he handed us a plastic bag. And we thought, well, what's in the plastic bag? It's not ours. We said, oh, no, it's not. It's from Aziz. It's a gift for your journey. And inside the bag, there were dates and there were nuts and everything for our journey. So again, it's just something that Aziz isn't unique in that sense. He's a very special man. It's very important to the journey and the story, but he's just doing what everyone else did as part of just being him in his culture and in this country. It was just a phenomenal sort of thing to experience. And I always think about that when I'm in a situation when I'm able to sort of provide hospitality to someone else. I've not yet been in the position to offer anything in the sort of realms that Aziz has, but one day I hope that I will be. So we headed north on the train, and things got pretty rural pretty quickly. It started looking a bit like the Wild West. It gets pretty dusty, pretty dry, and pretty empty. It's quite a tough place to travel around unless you've got pretty good cars and buses. The minibuses in Sudan are slightly more decked out inside, quite carpeted, which is quite nice. But on the road north, there's kind of one place which is quite important. And it's not quite how it seems at first. So the first thing you see is this random petrol station in the middle of nowhere. And it really is in the middle of nowhere. But the petrol station is the marker for something much more important and much more exciting. So this is the inside of the petrol station. Nothing freaky about an abandoned petrol station in the middle of the desert where all the doors and windows are open and the wind's just blowing through. But we headed off from the petrol station, off the road, in search of this, the Royal City. And the Royal City is a collection of pyramids. So when we think pyramids, you immediately think of Egypt. But there's actually more pyramids in Sudan than there are in Egypt. But people don't know about them because they're not visited. So we headed towards the Royal City, and we began to see these small pyramids. And actually, these small pyramids are the playground of a small family that live really nearby. And so we met up with this family, and again, we were invited to their house to have tea and to chat. And don't tell any sort of archaeologists, but they love climbing all over these antiquities and jumping off them. It's a great game for them. And it was just, again, this kind of real insight into somewhere which we wouldn't previously have had the opportunity to do. We sat there for hours without any shared language, just talking and playing, cards and showing pictures and scribbling things down and drawing little animals, and just having communication without any words was something quite humbling to be able to do that. And then the pyramids themselves. These are the pyramids of Meroe, and they are an absolutely phenomenal sight. You don't need the audio on it, but just to show you just how many pyramids they are. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of them stretching off into the distance, and no one's there. We had the whole place completely to ourselves. We were able to explore them, run up and down and see what we can see. The one other person we saw all day was this one researcher from the University of Khartoum, and his job is to go through every single brick on every single pyramid and document the graffiti, some of which he thinks is really, really quite old. And I really like the fact that these, monuments, which have been there for thousands of years, have marks of human kind of visitation, hopefully, from thousands of years ago. And perhaps, I don't know, but I assume that Reuben will have at least known of these pyramids, even if he didn't get a chance to visit during his time there. Not really wanting to return to the petrol station, we sort of headed out into the desert to see whether it was possible to sleep there. And so we did our best to sort of sleep in the middle of the desert, which is quite exciting. Quite challenging. All you've got is a tiny little tent in the vastness of the desert, but quite good fun. And being woken up by a man on a camel is always quite exciting, especially when that man then invites you to have breakfast, and you're, just given this for breakfast. This wasn't the most exciting of breakfast. Sort of a bowl full of cold semolina and some sort of honeyed pastries, a bit of baklava. But again, this was, completely unwarranted. This wasn't paid for. This was just, you slept the night in the desert. I'm walking by. Come to my house. You can have breakfast. Not a problem. And so we continued our journey north, and we continued to follow the River Nile. And the River Nile was our constant companion all the way along here until we got to the very far north of Sudan, into a town called Wadi Halfa. And Wadi Halfa is a bit of a transit town. It's sort of where the train line finishes, and it's where the ferry starts to get onto Lake Aswan or Lake Nasser and head up to the Aswan Dam in Egypt. And so we had to spend a few days in Wadi Halfa waiting for our boat. There's not a great deal to do in Wadi Halfa. We played a lot of pool, and the locals played a lot of computer games. We ate a lot more bread. Nick tried on a few suits and some white shoes. Not really desert appropriate, but it was something to do, wander around. And then eventually our boat came, and it was time for us to jump on that ferry, which would head us north across the lake and into Egypt. And so we decided to spend the night out on the deck for a couple of reasons, because we wanted to see the stars, because middle of the desert, it's fantastic to see the stars away from all the light pollution. But also we hoped to see a glimpse of Abu Simbel as we went past. So Abu Simbel, obviously a very famous site in Egypt, which got moved when they built the Aswan Dam and they flooded the lake. Unfortunately, we basically slept through it, because it turns out the desert nights are really, really cold. And despite it being, 40, 45 degrees during the day, at night time it's extremely cold. And so there we are in our kind of jumpers, our jackets, and our Ethiopian blankets that we picked up on a whim. And it turns out they were very useful. So that was quite good. And so that ended our time in Sudan. And we entered Egypt, and Egypt was a completely different ball game. And this is a whole other adventure in itself, so I won't go into it now, perhaps for another time. But it was really interesting to see the contrasts between, firstly, Ethiopia, but also Sudan and Egypt, a country which is very familiar to tourists in a lot of ways, but also has a lot of problems recently with tourism and people choosing not to go to Egypt. So we met some more characters, and we took some more interesting transport, and we saw some antiquities, including the pyramids, and we became quite famous for a brief moment of time, more famous than the pyramids for this group of tourists who found us very interesting, exciting for some reason. And without kind of like going into the whole rest of the journey, just having the opportunity to go somewhere with that link to a family past, it was kind of an excuse to go in the first place. But when I did go, I learned so much more about this incredible place. And I think Sudan is the perfect example of a country where you hear lots and lots of things, be it through the media, be it through the stuff on the news, and it's often painted in quite a negative way because it comes from one side of an opinion. But my experience of the place is completely different to that. And I'm so fortunate to have had that experience, and I would absolutely love to return one day to experience a bit more. And I've obviously got this photograph now, which really is going to be really, really special to me. It's always going to be special to me. And I sort of hope that this journey, perhaps in the future, someone might go back and that photograph will be on a wall somewhere, and that might inspire someone to go on their own journey sometime and to see what's out there. So thank you very much for listening. I'll finish there, and then I think there might be a few questions in the chat, so I'll have a go at answering any of those that are around.